My son looked me in the eyes on Thanksgiving night and said I was nothing more than his mother's mistake. The words landed harder than any blow. The dining room went silent, forks frozen in midair, while my ex-wife's new husband smirked from the head of the table, the seat I used to fill. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his glass of wine untouched, his jaw tight with years of anger I didn't know had grown so sharp. "You're not my father," he said again, louder this time. "Daniel is. He pays the bills. He shows up. You're just the man who left." I felt the heat rise in my chest, but I couldn't speak. For a moment all I could see was the boy who once begged me to carry him on my shoulders at the county fair, who laughed so hard at the carousel that cotton candy stuck to his hair. That boy was gone. Across the table, Margaret, my ex-wife, lowered her eyes, unable to defend me. Daniel poured himself another drink as if this was entertainment. My hands trembled around the carving knife, the turkey before me already cold. When Ethan pushed back his chair and stood, the scrape of wood on tile sounded like thunder. "Don't follow me," he snapped. As though I were the intruder, he stormed upstairs, leaving his words behind like shattered glass. The room buzzed with whispers. I remained frozen, staring at the empty space where my son had been. The word father suddenly stolen, replaced by silence so heavy it crushed the air from my lungs. I woke the next morning to a house that felt smaller than ever. The guest room where I slept still smelled faintly of fresh paint, a reminder that this was no longer my home. Margaret had redecorated after I left, erasing every trace of me from the walls. Family portraits were gone, my old books boxed up and sold at yard sales. The only things that remained were memories that clung to the corners of the rooms, stubborn and heavy. I made coffee in a kitchen that wasn't mine, using a machine I didn't recognize. The chair I had once claimed at the table was now Daniel's, and I sat instead by the window, staring at the yard where Ethan had played as a boy. I remembered building him a treehouse in the old oak, hammering each board while he watched from below, his little hands clutching a box of nails like treasure. That treehouse was torn down the year after I left, replaced by a manicured garden that looked like it had come out of a catalog. Life after the divorce had been quiet, too quiet. I rented a small apartment across town. 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom, one life reduced to the bare minimum. The silence followed me everywhere. Some nights I would cook for 2 out of habit, only to scrape the second plate into the trash. Other nights I sat with the television on mute, just so I didn't have to hear my own breath echo through the rooms. I still tried to call Ethan. At first, he picked up. His voice was polite, short, the kind of tone you use with a stranger. Then the calls grew fewer. He stopped answering altogether after Margaret remarried. Daniel stepped in with his confidence and his money, and I became the shadow in the background of my own family's story. Holidays were the hardest. I always hoped for an invitation, some sign that I still belonged. Most years, nothing came. This Thanksgiving had been the first time in nearly 2 years that Ethan had spoken more than a handful of words to me. And those words had cut so deep I could still feel them echoing in my chest. I rinsed out my coffee cup and placed it carefully in the sink, as though keeping everything neat might hold me together. Outside, the street was quiet, the neighbors' flags limp in the cold November wind. I had no work to go to, no family waiting for me. My days blurred together into endless mornings and long nights. I lived on routine now: coffee at 7, walk at 9, frozen dinner at 6, and always the waiting for Ethan to call, to forgive, to remember who I once was to him. The phone on the counter buzzed. My heart jumped before I even looked at the screen. It wasn't Ethan. It was a reminder for a doctor's appointment I had already canceled twice. I let the screen go dark again, the hope draining as quickly as it had sparked. I sat back in the chair by the window, watching the bare branches sway in the wind, and wondered how many more days I could live like a ghost in a life that had already moved on without me. I still remember the sound of Ethan's laughter when he was little, sharp and bright, bouncing through the rooms of our old house. Back then, I thought those sounds would last forever. He would run barefoot across the hardwood floors, his toy cars clutched tight in his fists, begging me to build him tracks with masking tape that zigzagged across the living room. Margaret would lean against the doorway, smiling in that way she used to before our lives started to fray. For a long time, we felt like a family that couldn't be broken. Every summer we went to the lake. I can still see Ethan sitting on my shoulders, splashing water down my back, yelling that he was the king of the world. I'd paddle us out into the deeper water, where the reflections of the trees shimmered across the surface, and he'd dive off with no fear, trusting I'd be there to pull him back to the boat. Trust, that's what bound us. It was a bond so strong that I never imagined it could be severed. Birthdays were our favorite days. I always made him a chocolate cake with too much frosting, and he'd stick his fingers in it before the candles were even lit. Margaret laughed then. Real laughter. Not the polite kind she uses now. We'd sing, off-key and loud, and Ethan would squeeze his eyes shut, making a wish with all the seriousness of a boy who believed his father could make anything come true. I think about Christmas mornings too, the way he'd race down the stairs before the sun was up, dragging me along, my eyes still half closed. He'd tear into the wrapping paper like it was the best day of his life. Once, when he was 8, he hugged me so hard I could barely breathe after opening the bicycle I had saved for months to buy. That hug was proof, in that moment, that I mattered more than anything money could offer. Those memories return to me in fragments now. Flashes of warmth that sting more than comfort. I try to hold on to them, but they slip away, replaced by the cold reality of what stands between us today. Somewhere along the way, my son stopped laughing with me. He stopped seeing me as the man who built tree houses and baked cakes and held him when nightmares woke him in the dark. He began to see me as someone who had failed. I sometimes wonder when it started. Was it the night I came home late from work too many times? Or when the layoff happened, and the weight of bills and rejection letters dulled the light in my eyes? Or was it when Margaret stopped looking at me with love and started seeing me as a burden? I searched through every memory, every detail, trying to pinpoint the moment the ground beneath my family cracked. But the truth is, I don't know. What I do know is that once upon a time, I was his whole world. And now, I am just a shadow. The fall began on a Tuesday. I sat in a glass room that smelled like coffee and lemon cleaner, while a young manager read from a script about restructuring. He said my role no longer existed. He slid a folder across the table like a final bill. I walked out with a cardboard box that held a mug, a plant with 2 yellow leaves, and the framed picture of my boy with chocolate on his face. The elevator mirrored the shape of my shoulders as they dropped. No one met my eyes in the lobby. I drove home in a rain that did not know how to stop. The wipers could not keep up. My hands would not let go of the wheel. So I sat in the driveway until the rain slowed. Margaret opened the door and took in the box. Her mouth made the shape of "oh," but no sound came. "We will be fine," she said, and she set the plant on the counter like a guest that would not stay. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to be the man who made fine true. In the first weeks, I woke at 5 as if the job still called me. I ironed a shirt I did not need. I sent out resumes while the coffee went cold. I refreshed my email until the screen blurred. I learned the taste of automated replies. I learned how silence could arrive with a perfect subject line that said "thank you for your interest." I told myself it was a matter of time. I cleaned the garage. I fixed the porch light. I cooked dinner and said it was because I liked it. The truth was cheaper than pride. Bills began to speak louder than we did. The mortgage, the car, the utilities that used to vanish with a click, now lingered on the counter like small storms. Margaret kept a notebook by the toaster. She wrote numbers in neat lines and tapped her pen against the margin. Some nights she worked late and sent a text at 10. Working on grant reports. Be back soon. I sat with the television on mute and tried to count how many applications make a future. I went to a job fair at the convention center and stood in a line that wrapped past a booth selling pretzels. A recruiter, with a bright smile, scanned my paper and asked me to upload it online. She was the age of my son. I thanked her and stepped aside so the next person could hand over their hope. On the drive home, I practiced how to tell Margaret it went great. The words stuck in my throat like a dry cracker. Money left the house in small ways, and then all at once. We canceled the streaming services and the gym. We stopped eating out. I sold my fishing gear to a man who called me sir. I took on delivery runs in a borrowed sedan. Winter wind found the hole in my coat and lived there. I told Ethan it was a side project. He nodded and looked out the window at anything that was not me. The first time a card declined, it was at the grocery store. Ethan stood beside me with a sliding basket of cereal and milk. The cashier kept her voice soft and asked if I had another form of payment. I said yes and dug through my wallet for cash that was not there. We went to the car and I counted coins from the cup holder into my palm. When I returned to the line, the cashier smiled too kindly. Ethan looked down at his shoes. The walk back to the car felt like a mile of glass. There were small fights that grew teeth. I said I had sent out 100 applications. Margaret said she needed stability and not numbers. I said I needed time to land right. She said time was the one thing the bank did not sell. We went to bed and lay on the edges like strangers who could not move. In the morning, her wedding ring sat on the nightstand while she got dressed. She forgot to put it back on or chose not to. I could not tell. The house changed in quiet ways. The photos in the hallway thinned. The team picture from Ethan's baseball season moved to a box in the closet. My tools disappeared to pay for a repair on the furnace. Margaret bought new curtains and called the color pearl. The old blue ones found their way to the curb. She joined a fitness class that met at 6 in the morning. She was out the door before I woke. She came home with a new energy that did not touch me. Ethan learned to measure me by absence. He asked his mother to drive him to practice. He said my car made a sound and he did not want to be late. I told him I could fix the sound. He said it was fine and closed his door with careful hands as if I might break. I went to the field anyway and watched from the far fence. He hit a double and did not look toward the place where I stood. I tried to make myself useful. I cooked. I cleaned. I organized bills. I mowed the lawn in straight lines that could have been measured with a ruler. When Margaret walked in from work, she paused in the doorway, taking in the order, and said thank you with the voice you use for a neighbor who watered your plants. She smelled different. A new perfume. I asked about her day. She said busy and moved past me to the sink. At night I wrote lists in a notebook I kept by the bed. Network. Update references. Call Martin from the plant. Revise resume. On a blank page I wrote a promise. I will make this right. I tore the page out and taped it to the fridge. A week later, the corner curled like it was tired. A month later, spaghetti sauce dotted the word right like a small wound. Spring came slow. The grass returned. Then the ants. Then the fear that woke me at 3. I stared at the ceiling fan and counted the same 3 blades 100 times. Margaret lay still beside me with her back turned. Sometimes her phone lit up on the nightstand and threw a square of light against the wall. She cupped the screen so I would not see it. I told myself she was reading the news. The truth sat in a chair across the room and said nothing. The day the final severance deposit hit our account, I sat at the table and watched the number arrive. It looked the same as any other number. Neat and harmless. I knew what it meant. A clock with no hands. I closed the laptop and breathed into my hands until the air warmed my palms. In the other room, the washer knocked against the wall, like a neighbor asking us to turn down the music. I stood, took the box from that Tuesday, and put the framed picture back on the shelf. I touched the glass where Ethan's smile stretched wide. The cold of it went through me. By summer, we moved through the house like people on different trains. We nodded. We exchanged facts. We spoke about schedules and groceries and the weather. We did not speak about us. Margaret began to say my name the way doctors do when they are about to deliver news. I heard the future under every syllable. It sounded like a door closing. The day the papers arrived, the sky was too blue. It felt wrong to walk through so much sunlight while carrying an envelope that ended my life as I had known it. Margaret had left it on the kitchen table. Her signature already there in black ink. Neat and final. She did not wait for a conversation. She had written a note instead. It is time. Please do not make this harder than it has to be. I sat at that table for hours, staring at the lines that divided our past. House to her. Car to me. Savings split in half. Though half of nothing is still nothing. Custody not even mentioned. Ethan was old enough to choose. And he had already chosen. His silence was louder than any ruling. When I finally walked into the courthouse, the building smelled of paper and floor polish. My hands shook as I held the pen. The clerk slid the forms toward me with the same expression she must have used for thousands of others before me. She said, "Sign here." Her voice had no weight. I wrote my name and felt it carve me out of my own story. Outside, Margaret waited with Daniel in the parking lot. She did not look at me. He did. He put his arm around her shoulders like he had won something. Maybe he had. Ethan stood between them. Taller now. His jaw set in a way that did not belong to me anymore. He nodded once. A gesture polite and cold. Then climbed into Daniel's car. They drove away while I stood alone with a stack of papers in my hand and the echo of my son's indifference. The house was too big after they left. Every room whispered their absence. Ethan's sneakers by the door. Gone. Margaret's perfume in the closet. Gone. Laughter in the hallway. Gone. I walked through it all like a ghost trespassing in a place he once owned. Eventually, I sold it because the silence grew heavier than the mortgage. My new apartment was small. 2 rooms and a balcony that faced a brick wall. I bought second-hand furniture and told myself it was temporary. Nights were long. The fridge hummed like company. The clock ticked too loud. I found myself sitting at the edge of my bed, holding the old photo of Ethan with cake on his cheeks, whispering promises to no one. I will make it right. I will find a way back. But weeks turned to months. The calls I made went unanswered. The texts stayed unread. Sometimes I drove past Margaret's new house, a place that looked brighter, louder, full of life. Through the window, I saw Daniel at the table, Ethan laughing beside him. They looked like the picture I had lost. My chest ached, but I kept watching, memorizing a scene that no longer included me. The hardest moment came one Saturday afternoon, when I saw Ethan in the yard, tossing a ball back and forth with Daniel. The sound of their voices carried over the fence. Daniel shouted, "Good throw, son," and Ethan laughed. That word son cut me in half. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles burned. I drove away before they could see me crying. In that moment, I realized I was no longer the father in my son's story. I was the past tense, the shadow, the man who once held a place that had been replaced. I met Daniel in the doorway of the house that used to be mine. He wore a navy jacket that fit like it was made for him. His smile was easy. His handshake was firm. He said my name as if we had been friends for years. The smell of his cologne filled the hall. I noticed the watch. It was the kind you do not buy on sale. Margaret moved around him like a planet that had found a stronger sun. Ethan hovered at the stairs, listening. His face, careful. Daniel said he had heard a lot about me. He said stability was important for a boy in high school. He said he could help with rides, with fees, with the little things that add up. I told him I could manage. He nodded and called it teamwork. The word sat between us like a card he had already played. The first gift arrived a week later. New cleats. The kind Ethan had looked at online and closed the tab. Margaret said Daniel had a work discount. Ethan pulled them from the box and ran his thumb over the bright stitching. He did not look at me. I said they were nice. Daniel said nothing and watched my son lace them with quick hands that shook a little from excitement. On Saturday there was a game. I came early and stood by the old bleachers, with a coffee cup that burned my palm. Daniel parked a black SUV behind the backstop and walked to the field like he owned the place. He clapped loud. He shouted pointers with a voice that carried. He called Ethan by a nickname I did not know. After the game, he tossed a ball in the air and spun it once like a coin. "Good work, kid," he said. The coach shook Daniel's hand before he packed the gear. I stood in line behind nothing and waited for Ethan to look over. He didn't. Daniel began to show up in all the places I used to fill. Parent meetings, dentist appointments, school concerts. He had time, he said. He had the kind of job that let him step out. He liked efficiency. He liked results. He liked to say no problem when someone thanked him. People learned his name fast. He learned the secretary's name and the custodian's name and the neighbor's dog's name. When he spoke to Ethan, he leaned in as if the whole world were the boy. That is a trick that makes children love you. He invited them to the country club one Sunday. I saw the photos on social media. Ethan in a white polo that did not belong to him a week earlier. Margaret by the pool in sunglasses. Daniel at the grill with a pair of tongs and a grin. The caption said, "Family Day." I looked up from my phone and stared at the empty plate on my table. I had made pasta for two again, without meaning to. I washed the extra dish and told myself the soap stung my eyes. When Daniel and I did speak alone, his voice stayed calm. He said the boy needed structure. He said I was welcome at every event. Then mentioned how busy I must be with new work. I said the boy needs me. He said the boy needs all of us. Then he smiled and added that he would handle tuition if needed. He made it sound like an offer. It felt like a line drawn with a ruler across a map that used to be mine. Gifts kept coming with the ease of someone who never checks a price. A laptop. A winter coat that fit like a promise. A set of review classes for the SAT that met on nights Ethan used to come to my place for dinner. The schedule changed. The world adjusted around the man who could pay for speed. I offered to help with flashcards and practice essays. Ethan said he had study group with Daniel's friend who tutored on Tuesdays. He spoke fast and looked past my shoulder. One night I took Ethan to a diner after practice. The booth was cracked at the corners. The fries were hot. We used to come here when he was little and count trucks on the highway that roared by the windows. He picked at his plate and checked his phone. When he laughed, it was at a message from Daniel. I asked what was funny. He said nothing and turned the screen down on the table. I watched the ketchup make a red pool near the fork and thought how silence can be louder than any insult. Margaret wore a new ring by winter. It flashed when she handed me the holiday schedule she had typed in neat blocks. Christmas Eve with us. Christmas morning with them. It was fair on paper. Paper does not feel. I brought a wrapped book and a scarf I had saved up to buy. Daniel gifted a weekend trip to a ski resort 2 states away. Ethan hugged him first. I said the scarf would be warm on the mountain. He thanked me and set it on a chair. Little phrases changed next. At first he called Daniel by his name, then he tried out sir when he wanted something. Then he called him coach in front of other players because Daniel started helping at practice. The first time I heard the word dad in that direction, it was outside school in a half-full parking lot. It slipped out of him when he waved goodnight. He caught it. He looked at me quickly. Daniel brushed it away with a soft pat on Ethan's shoulder and told him to grab his bag. They drove off with the radio loud. I stood by my car and rested my forehead on the cool roof until I could breathe again. Daniel was not cruel. That would have been easier to fight. He was generous. He remembered details. He solved problems fast. He returned calls. He made things smooth. He never raised his voice. He never spoke badly about me in public. He did not need to. He let time and money and presence do his work. Once, after a school fundraiser, he pulled me aside near the gym doors and thanked me for donating 2 old ticket strips I had bought to help. He put a hand on my shoulder like we were brothers. He said, "Everyone wins when a child has more than one man who cares." He said I should not take it personally. The sentence was a blade hidden in a blanket. I smiled and said I understood. I did not. By spring, Ethan's world had a new center. It had a better car, a bigger table, longer vacations, stronger words like network and internship and reference. I tried to speak the old language of Saturday pancakes and small jokes and radio songs we used to sing out of tune. He spoke the new one with ease. When I told him I missed him, he said, "We would figure out a schedule." He sounded like a calendar invite. The day I knew something had fully shifted was the day his car needed brakes. I offered to take it to my friend's shop, a place that had fixed my engines for years at a price I could manage. Daniel said he had a mechanic he trusted. He said he would handle it. Ethan handed him the keys without looking at me. The sound of metal against metal as Daniel's palm closed around the ring was small. It still felt like a door. I drove home slow that night. The road had black ice and a low fog that made the streetlights blur. In the rearview, I watched the red tail of a different family move away from me. Steady and bright. I told myself it was only a season. I told myself love could outlast credit limits and invitations and perfect timing. I told myself boys grow and return to the man who knew them first. Then I sat at my small table, opened my empty calendar for the week, and understood that a new gravity had taken hold of my son and would not let go easily. I started planning for the day weeks in advance. It would be the first time Ethan agreed to visit me in months. And I wanted everything perfect. I wrote menus on scrap paper and rewrote them when I thought the meals were not special enough. Roast chicken with herbs. Mashed potatoes the way he liked when he was little. A pie from the bakery down the street, because mine always came out too soft in the middle. I polished the small table until I could see my face in the wood. I took out the only 2 plates that matched and set them side by side. I ironed the old tablecloth Margaret had packed in a box when I moved. It was faded, but it still smelled faintly of cinnamon and pine, the way holidays once did. I even bought candles, though I had not lit any in years. The morning of his visit, I woke before sunrise. My apartment felt lighter just knowing he might walk through the door. I swept the floor twice. Even though it was already clean, I stood in front of the mirror, shaving carefully, trying to erase the tired lines that work and loneliness had carved into my face. I wanted him to see a father who still mattered, not a man beaten down by time. By noon, the food was ready, and the apartment smelled of rosemary and garlic. I kept checking the window for headlights in the lot. Every sound made me stand. A car door slammed outside, and my pulse jumped. But it wasn't him. I sat again and tried to steady my breathing. The clock ticked, slow and cruel. Finally, at 12:30, there was a knock. My heart leapt. When I opened the door, Ethan stood there, taller, sharper in his features than I remembered. His hair was styled the way Daniel's always was. Neat, controlled. He wore a blazer, too formal for lunch with his father. Behind him, Margaret's car idled at the curb. I hugged him quickly, but his arms barely moved. "Thanks for lunch, Dad," he said. But his voice held no warmth. He stepped inside and looked around my apartment like it was a waiting room. I guided him to the table, lifting the lid off the chicken with a smile that felt too big. "It smells good," he said politely. "The way you compliment a stranger." We ate in silence. I asked about school, about his classes, about the things I used to know without asking. He answered with short phrases, eyes drifting to his phone. When it buzzed, he smiled at Daniel's name flashing on the screen. My chest tightened. He typed back quickly, forgetting I was watching. After the plates were cleared, I tried one last thing. I pulled out the photo album I had kept for years, the one with his baby pictures, his first day of school, the camping trips. "Do you remember this?" I asked, sliding the book toward him. He glanced at the page, nodded once, then shut it. "That was a long time ago." "Dad?" The word "Dad" slipped from his lips, but it carried no weight. It sounded like an obligation. He stood and checked his watch. "I promised Daniel I'd be back to help with something," he said. "I'll see you around." I followed him to the door, desperate to hold him longer, desperate to remind him of who I was. But the engine outside was already running, and his steps were quick. He hugged me with one arm, barely touching, before walking away. I stood there, the smell of rosemary still hanging in the air, 2 plates on the table, 1 chair pushed back. The food was still warm, but I had never felt so cold. The next time Ethan came, he didn't come alone. I had cleaned the apartment again, hoping to make it feel less bare. I set the table for 2 just like before. But when the knock came, I opened the door to see him standing between Margaret and Daniel. My chest sank before a word was spoken. Ethan smiled politely, as if rehearsed, and said, "I thought it would be nice if we all had dinner together." Margaret stepped past me with a careful look that avoided my eyes. Daniel carried a bottle of wine and scanned the room like a man assessing property. He called the place cozy. That single word made my apartment feel smaller. I scrambled for more plates, more forks, stretching the meal I had planned for 2 into a performance for 4. The chicken was carved thin, the potatoes scooped carefully, the pie sliced into pieces smaller than I wanted. I tried to play host, pouring drinks with hands that trembled. But Daniel had already taken the lead, seating himself at the head of the table, the spot that should have been mine. Ethan sat beside him, leaning into his orbit. Margaret filled the space across from me, her purse still on her lap like she didn't plan to stay. The conversation drifted the wrong way fast. Daniel complimented the food, but it sounded like an afterthought. He asked Ethan about his college applications, and Ethan lit up, listing schools, programs, plans. He spoke as though I wasn't there. Daniel nodded with approval at each answer, adding advice about internships and connections. My own attempts to ask about his classes came out thin, ignored in the flow. At one point, Ethan looked directly at Daniel and said, "I wouldn't even be considering half these schools without your guidance. You've done more for me in 2 years than anyone else has in my life." My fork froze in my hand. Margaret shifted uncomfortably, her eyes flickering toward me. But she said nothing. Daniel only smiled and patted Ethan on the back. "That's what real fathers do," he said. The words landed heavier than the silence that followed. I forced a swallow, the taste of garlic and shame mixing in my mouth. I wanted to shout, to remind them all who had stayed up with Ethan when he was sick, who had built tree houses and cheered from freezing bleachers, who had given everything he had. But my voice caught in my throat. Instead, I poured myself water and stared at the flicker of the candle. I watched Daniel reach for another slice of pie. Watched Ethan laugh at his joke. Watched Margaret look relieved that the table wasn't tense anymore. I sat at the edge, a guest in my own story. Invisible at the dinner meant to heal something already gone. When the plates were cleared, Ethan stood and hugged Daniel first, calling him Dad without hesitation. He hugged Margaret next. When he came to me, he offered only a quick pat on the shoulder, his eyes already elsewhere. Then they left together, their voices fading down the hall. I locked the door behind them and turned back to the table. The candles burned low. The plates were mismatched, the food half-eaten. I gathered the dishes slowly, each clink of porcelain echoing through the apartment like a clock striking midnight. For the first time, I felt not just alone, but erased. It was a Friday night when Ethan finally told me what he wanted. He arrived later than expected, still in his blazer, carrying a folder thick with papers. His voice was firm, the way a young man speaks when he believes time is running out. "Dad, I need your help." I pulled out a chair for him, relieved just to hear the word Dad, though it sounded more like a formality than love. He spread the papers across my table. Business plans, projections, charts colored in bold ink. He said he wanted to start his own company, a small digital consulting firm, and he needed money to launch it. $100,000. The number rang in my ears. I tried to keep my face calm, but my hand tightened on the arm of the chair. Ethan continued talking, excitement flooding his words, pointing to growth curves and profit margins. He believed in this idea, and he believed I could give him what he needed. I asked him if he had gone to a bank, looked into a loan, maybe found other investors. He shook his head. "They take too long. They don't believe in me the way you should." He leaned forward, eyes sharp. "You always told me to chase my dreams. This is it. Now I need you to prove you meant it." I nodded slowly, though my stomach was twisting. I had savings, but not nearly enough. 25,000 if I emptied every account, if I sacrificed every bit of security I had left. But it would still be a fraction of what he asked. I tried to explain, gently, that it wasn't possible. His face hardened. "You always have excuses." Daniel wouldn't hesitate. He knows what it means to invest in me. He would do it without thinking twice. The way he said Daniel's name cut deeper than the request itself. My son wasn't just asking for money. He was measuring my love against another man's wallet. And I was coming up short. I promised him I would try. I told him I would do everything I could. His expression softened for a moment, just enough to give me hope. Then he gathered his papers, stuffed them back into the folder, and stood. "I'll need an answer by Sunday," he said. "If you can't do it, Daniel will." When the door closed behind him, the apartment seemed smaller than ever. I sat at the table, staring at the empty glass he had left, my reflection broken in the water at the bottom. I picked up the folder, the weight of it pressing down like stone. That night, I pulled out every bank statement, every envelope, every hidden bit of cash. I made lists of what I could sell: my car, my furniture, even the tools I had kept from the days I still believed I could fix anything. Each calculation ended the same. No matter how much I scraped together, I was still tens of thousands short. I lay awake until morning, rehearsing the words I would say, knowing none of them would be enough. Sunday came like a test I knew I would fail. I cleaned the apartment again and set out the same plates. I made the same roast because hope repeats itself. I folded cloth napkins I had not used in years. I put on the shirt. Ethan once said, made me look sharp. I checked my accounts one more time. Even though I already knew the numbers. 25,000 if I drained everything. The rest, a cliff I could not cross. At noon, I heard car doors. More than one. When I opened the door, Ethan stood in front with his folder. Margaret was behind him. Daniel carried a small envelope in the easy way of a man who never worries about the weight of paper. They all smiled. They all said hello. Daniel looked past me into the room and said the same word again. Cozy. I nodded and stepped aside. I served lunch with careful hands. I tried to make this feel like family even though I knew we were acting. Ethan sat where the light hit his face. He looked older than last year. His jaw was set. Margaret kept her purse on the chair like she might leave at any moment. Daniel placed the envelope on the table beside his water and rested his fingers on it as if it were a pet. We ate. The chicken was tender. No one said much about it. Daniel asked Ethan about revenue projections. Ethan pulled out the charts and spoke fast. He pointed to growth lines. He used words like conversion and runway. I tried to follow. I wanted to be proud. I wanted to be the man who could say yes without flinching. I cleared the plates and brought the pie. Daniel did not touch his slice. He stayed with his water and the small envelope. Margaret dabbed her mouth with a napkin and said the food was lovely. She said it softly, like a bandage on a wound that needed stitches. Ethan looked at me. So, can you do it? He did not say please. He did not say Dad. He said it like a contract line. I took a breath. I told him the truth. I can offer 25. It is everything I have. I will help in other ways. I will help with the work. I will help with contacts. I will show up. I will stay. He stared at me as if I had spoken a language he did not understand. 25. He repeated. That is it. After all these years. After everything. Margaret shifted in her chair. She opened her mouth and closed it. Her hands folded on the table like a prayer that had lost words. Daniel lifted the envelope and slid it toward Ethan. He did it slowly, like a teacher showing a student where the answer sits. He did not look at me when he spoke. He said he admired initiative. He said timing matters. He said belief matters more. He said he wanted to invest in a young man who knows where he is going. Ethan opened the flap. He pulled out a check. The figure sat in ink like it had always been there, waiting to be read. 100,000. The room went quiet. Even the clock seemed to stop. My throat closed. Heat rose under my collar. I knew this moment. I had seen it from a distance in a dozen small scenes. Now it stood at my table and smiled at my son. Ethan looked from the check to Daniel. His eyes shone. He said thank you before he remembered I was in the room. He stood and hugged Daniel with both arms. He said, "You are the reason this will happen." He said, "I knew you would believe in me." He said, "You are a real father." The words struck like a blunt object, not sharp, heavy. They flattened the air. I sat very still. I watched my own hands fold on the table in a way that was not mine. I saw the steam from the pie fade. I did not yell. I did not make a scene. There is a kind of pain that has no sound. I reached for my water and missed the glass. It tipped and ran across the wood in a clear river. The wet line reached the place where the check lay. Daniel moved the paper before the water touched it. He smiled and said, "No harm done." He tapped the corner dry with his napkin. His movements were graceful. He had practiced being the man who fixes things. Ethan did not look at the spill. He looked at Daniel the way small boys look at fireworks. Margaret stood to get towels. She pressed them into my hands and said, "It is fine." Her voice tried to be kind. It could not carry the weight. I found words. I told Ethan that money is not love. I told him that belief is not only a check. I told him I had held him when he could not sleep. I told him I had taught him to ride without training wheels. I told him I had sat through every winter game and clapped until my palms burned. The sentences sounded like a list of receipts from a store that had closed down. He lifted the check to the light. He said, "This is what belief looks like." He said, "You never did this." He said, "All you have are stories." He said, "Daniel changed my future in a minute." I felt my face heat. I tried to slow my breathing the way the clinic had taught me after the panic in the winter. In through the nose, out through the mouth. The air trembled. Daniel finally looked at me. He said, "This does not have to be a contest." He said, "There is room for everyone." He said, "We all want what is best for Ethan." His tone was correct. His eyes were calm. He had won and did not gloat. He did not have to. Ethan tucked the check into his folder like a passport. He pushed his chair back and stood. He came to me and put his hand on my shoulder. It was the touch you give a person you hope will not make a scene. He said, "Thank you for lunch." He said, "I will pay you back for groceries." He said, "You can keep your 25 for yourself." The last sentence was meant to be mercy. It landed as contempt. I nodded because there was nothing else left to do. Margaret gathered her purse. Daniel collected his envelope and wiped the spot where the water had been with the back of his hand, as if order itself depended on him. At the door, Ethan turned. For a second, his face cracked. The boy I knew looked out. I almost spoke his nickname. I almost said, "Come back and eat the rest of the pie and sit with me until the light fades the way we used to." The second closed. He said, "I will call you." He said it like a stranger. The hallway swallowed their voices. The apartment returned to its small shape. The check was gone. The plates were empty. The air felt colder than the weather outside. I stood in the doorway and let my hands shake. Then I closed the door and slid the deadbolt into place. It felt like signing something I did not want to sign. I walked back to the table and sat in the chair Daniel had used like a throne. I put my hand on the wood and felt the grain under my palm. The water ring would leave a mark. It would not be large. It would not fade. I stared at that circle until the light went dull. I told myself to stand. I told myself to breathe. I told myself I was still a father even if the word would not sit in my son's mouth. The slap came faster than I ever imagined. One moment Ethan stood in front of me, folder under his arm, voice sharp with anger. The next, his palm connected with my cheek in a crack that echoed through the apartment. My head snapped to the side. A metallic taste filled my mouth where my tooth cut the inside of my lip. Silence followed. A silence so thick even the hum of the refrigerator seemed to stop. Margaret gasped, her hand flying to her chest. Daniel shifted in his chair, caught between shock and the satisfaction of knowing the battle was over. My son stood above me, chest heaving, eyes full of fury I could not recognize. "You are nothing to me," he spat. "Nothing." I stayed seated, my cheek burned. My body shook, but I did not move. Slowly, I reached for the napkin on the table, dabbing at the blood that had risen to the corner of my mouth. The stain spread, red against white, proof of what my love had become, proof of 30 years dismissed in a single violent gesture. Ethan's words rained down harder than the slap itself. "You never gave me what I needed. You never believed in me. Daniel is my real father. He proves it every single day." His voice cracked on real, like it was a weapon sharpened to pierce me. I lifted my eyes to him. For a moment, I saw the boy who once called me daddy, who once begged me not to let go of the back of his bike. That boy was gone, but something inside me shifted. The slap was meant to end me, to bury me under shame. Instead, it stripped away the last fear. I stood slowly, the room tilting as I rose. Ethan's face faltered, confusion flickering behind his anger. Margaret froze in her seat, tears streaming down her face. Daniel straightened but said nothing. his hands gripping the arms of the chair. I wiped the last trace of blood from my lip and steadied my voice. You are right, Ethan. I am not your real father. The words stunned the air. My son's fury cracked into disbelief. His mouth opened, but no sound came. Margaret's sobs grew louder, her hands trembling as she shook her head. Please, don't, she whispered. But it was time. I stepped closer to Ethan. When you were 2 years old, I carried you out of an orphanage. You were shaking, clinging to a stuffed bear with one eye missing. You didn't have a name anyone remembered. We gave you ours. We gave you a home. We gave you a life. My voice broke, but I held it steady enough to cut through his silence. Ethan stumbled back, hitting the wall behind him. That's not true, he whispered. You're lying. Margaret buried her face in her hands. It is true, she cried. We wanted to tell you, but the years passed, and it never felt like the right time. My son slid down the wall, collapsing onto the floor. His hands shook as he covered his face. Daniel looked at me for the first time without confidence, his eyes wide, the check still sitting useless on the table. I knelt in front of Ethan, ignoring the pain in my knees. I have chosen you every single day, I said. Every scraped knee, every late-night fever, every moment of joy and grief. I chose you because you were my son, not by blood, but by love. His shoulders shook. His sobs filled the room that had been silent only moments before. He looked up at me with red, wet eyes, reaching for the mark his slap had left on my cheek. I didn't know, he choked out. I caught his trembling hand and held it. Now you do, I whispered. Love is not a check. Love is staying when no one else will. Margaret's sobs quieted, her eyes full of regret. Daniel sat stiff, the weight of the truth pulling the ground from under him. The check no longer mattered. The lies no longer held. Only the raw truth filled the air. Heavier than money, sharper than betrayal. For the first time in years, my son saw me, not as the man he thought had failed him, but as the father who had chosen him against all odds. He stayed on the floor with his back to the wall and his hands over his face. His shoulders shook in hard waves. I knelt and waited. I did not touch him until the storm eased. When he finally lowered his hands, his eyes were raw and scared, like a child after a nightmare. I am sorry, he said. The words came out broken. I did not know. I did not understand what I was saying. I did not understand who I was hitting. I set the napkin on the table and reached for a clean towel, pressed it to my cheek. The sting was already less. The shame in his face was not. He stared at the mark his hand had made, as if it were a brand he could never wash off. I told him to breathe. In through the nose, out through the mouth. We had done this when he was small, and the dark felt too big. He tried, and the air steadied him. Margaret moved first. She came to him and sat on the floor beside us. Her hands shook as she touched his hair. I should have told you, she said. I was afraid you would think love was a lie. Love was not a lie, he said. The lie was that money is love. He turned to me. I said terrible things. I called him my real father. I threw away 30 years of you. I told him the 30 years were still here. Time does not leave when we fail. It waits. It gives us another try. He swallowed hard. The folder on his lap slid open and the check flashed in the light. The number no longer looked like hope. It looked like weight. Daniel stood very still by the chair he had used all afternoon, as if it might sink without his hands. The certainty was gone from his face. He tried to speak, and found no sentence that would land without breaking. At last he said, I did not know. I wanted to help. I stepped where I should not step. He looked at the check. The paper cracked a little under his fingers. He held it out to Ethan without the old pride. "This is yours only if you still want it after today." Ethan did not take it. He closed the folder and set it on the table beside the pie that had gone cold. He looked at me again. "Do you forgive me?" The question lived in the room like a small bird waiting for a hand to open. "I do," I said. Not because the slap was small. It was not. Not because the words were light. They were not. "I forgive you because I have been your father every day since you were 2. Fathers forgive. We teach and we try again." He nodded, and fresh tears ran down his face. He slid closer and put his forehead to my shoulder like he used to do when he was 5. I pressed my palm to the back of his head and felt the old shape of him under the new haircut and the new plans. His breath slowed. Mine did too. Margaret wiped her face and stood. "Quiet now. I need to let you two talk," she said. She looked at Daniel. He nodded and picked up his coat. He hesitated at the door and turned back to me. "If you will have me in his life, I will take your lead," he said. "I do not want to replace anyone. I never should have tried to be the center. I said that what the boy needed was less center and more circle. A circle holds. If he wants us both, we stand there together and do not pull." They left without ceremony. The hallway closed on their footsteps. The apartment settled, as if the furniture had been holding its breath. The light outside had gone soft. Street noise moved like a slow river far below us. We sat on the floor a while longer until our legs hurt. And then we stood and moved to the table. I brought ice for my cheek and 2 mugs of tea. He pushed the pie toward me and said we should eat it before it turns to stone. We ate with small bites and no rush. He asked me to tell him about the first day. I told him the room at the agency smelled like crayons and bleach. I told him the bear with one eye. I told him the way he reached for my collar and would not let go. He closed his eyes and listened as if he could see it. When he spoke again, his voice was calmer. "I do not want the check," he said. "Not like this. Maybe one day I will build what I dream about. Maybe I will start smaller and earn the rest. Will you help me write a plan that fits what we can do?" I said yes. I said we would start with a list tomorrow. We would map steps on paper and then take them one by one. We would use what we had. Time. Work. People who believe. He asked if we could fix things between us. I told him repair is not a single act. It is many small acts in the same direction. He said then, "Let us start small. Dinner on Thursdays. A call every morning for a week so I can hear your voice. A run on Saturdays like we used to when I was 13. He smiled a little at that. I said my knees might complain. He said then we will walk and nobody is keeping score. He stood and went to the sink and washed the plates and dried them and put them back where they belonged. The simple sound of water over ceramic felt like music. He looked around the room and laughed once without shame. "Cozy," he said. He meant it. I laughed too. And the word finally softened. Before he left, he took his phone out and blocked the calendar with a new entry that covered a month. Dinner with Dad. He sent it to me and to himself. He said no one else can book over this. Not school, not work, not Daniel. Then he grew serious. "I need to speak to him," he said. "I will tell him I am grateful. But I will tell him he cannot stand where you stand." At the door, he stopped and touched my cheek again. The mark was fading. He kissed the spot. Just a brush. Almost embarrassed. The way tall sons show love when they still remember being little. I heard his shoes in the hall and then the lift and then the quiet that comes after a good thing. I cleaned the table and folded the napkins and wiped the water ring. It will leave a faint circle no matter what I do. I keep it. It belongs to the room now. A record of the hour when something broke and something larger began. He called when he got home. He said, "I love you." He said it with a voice that had learned something new and old at the same time. I stood by the window and let the words settle into me like warmth after a storm. Outside, a bus sighed at the corner, and a dog barked, and two people argued about nothing important, and a light on the fourth floor blinked on. Life kept moving. So would we. In the morning, I took down the page from the fridge that said, "I will make this right." I wrote a new one. "We will make this right." I taped it beside the first and left the old stain of sauce where it had fallen months ago. You do not erase everything to begin again. You keep what taught you to stay. When Thursday came, he arrived early. He knocked and did not wait for me to answer before he called my name through the door. He used the right one. He used Dad. It fit the hallway. It fit my chest. It fit the room.